Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. We're starting a minute and a half early in the spirit of trying to use all possible time we have together to be both sharing ideas and learning new things from each other throughout the day. My name is Larry Susskind. I'm on the faculty at MIT and part of the program on negotiation and responsible for the TNRC, the Teaching Negotiation Resource Center, and with Lara, who you will also get to meet along the way. I find that in all the places where I teach, I spend 90% of the time talking with people about what we're going to teach. And I can't find that many people who want to talk about, and so how should we teach that? Why teach it that way? Why use those materials, that method, that organization of things? And so we want to build a network of people who care about how and why we teach negotiation, dispute resolution to certain audiences in particular ways. And if you haven't thought deeply about that, we hope today will kick off the commitment of some of your time on not just what you're hoping to teach, but why teach it that way, how to teach it most effectively. Some of the things, I hope, some of the things you'll hear today you don't know about, you haven't heard about. Not just because you're in business and this is what's happening in law, or you're in international relations and this is what's happening in public policy, because you haven't delivered courses online. It's really quite a different thing to build a course that gets delivered online. And a number of people in the room have done that, and we'll try to talk about what's different about taking everything you know, but putting it into a form that can be delivered online. And did you know you can use certain platforms for a lot of interaction amongst people taking courses online? So it's not just a lecture. They are negotiating with each other within the context of the online course. So how can you use these new technologies? That's certainly a question a number of people have listed to enhance the scope of what you can cover and who you can reach in different kinds of ways. So we want to update you on new developments in negotiation pedagogy, including new teaching and training materials developed and distributed by TNRC, but not only. A lot of people have very interesting materials, and you'll hear them talking during the day about that, and you should feel free to pursue with them, gee, is it possible to borrow that interesting case you talked about? Can I try it? Can I give you feedback about it? Does that make it worth it to you to lend it to me to use once or twice? And finally, we hope as a result of today, you will want to invest more of your time and energy in developing new and better ways of helping a range of learners become more effective negotiators.
Oh, we got to... we have a couple extra minutes to get started, so we will, as Larry encouraged us, I think, a short while ago, to take full advantage of our time to meet each other and to work together. I'm Brian Mandel. I'm a senior lecturer in public policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, a professional school of public policy. And I'll say a little more by way of introduction shortly about what it means for me to be at a professional school as distinct from a disciplinary department and doing the kind of work we're talking about today. My colleague Monica Giannone. What's really important about having Monica here and modeling for you, Monica was a student of mine in our Master of Public Policy program, did outstanding work in that program. And one of the central questions that students have for me over the past several years is, I really enjoy this work. Whether I'm in peace building, whether I'm going to go into more legal or public policy work, the question becomes, and it can feel awkward, what are the next steps for me professionally, not just what additional courses can I take. And so we created at the Kennedy School the beginnings of a path in which Monica is truly a pioneer and directs our Kennedy School negotiation project.
Great, thank you. So as Brian said, I'm Monica Giannone. I run the Kennedy School Negotiation Project, and the way, and why I'm here today, the way we think about our work that we do is how to make the students at the Kennedy School and people more broadly who are interested in leading in public spaces learn the necessary skills in negotiation that they will need in an increasingly complex world. So what I do and what we do is we think about how to teach, how to build curriculum for these students that we can then bring to other schools and outside in the world. We've run a bunch of programs with the US Congress, so thinking about what specifically would be useful for them and thinking about overcoming this partisanship. And we do this every day by developing simulations, by writing cases, by doing research, by figuring out what works specifically for the different students that we interact with. So students who definitely want to go into government, whether it's domestically or abroad, students who definitely don't want to go into government but will be working with these type of actors in the future. So we think about all of those things, and today we'll both talk a little bit about how we structure some of those courses, the methods we use, and some of the interesting design elements that we've built in to meet the need that students have. For me personally, I worked in DC politics before coming to the Kennedy School as someone who believes strongly in actually overcoming conflict. It was a tough place to be after a few years, and I decided I needed a change. I went to the Kennedy School to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And very much to Brian's point, had a light bulb moment sitting in a negotiation class that there's actually thinking and structure and frameworks behind what I was seeing that people really needed access to, that people could really benefit from. And so everything for me changed directions at that point. I didn't go back to DC, I stayed up here, where now I do all the work I do at the Kennedy School. I do training. I think a lot about negotiation and how we can get these skills to people, especially people who haven't traditionally had access to it. Brian will start by talking a little bit about overall how we think about teaching this in different types of courses. We will spend a lot of time later in the session talking about one class in particular that we teach at the Kennedy School, which is an advanced negotiation class, primarily for students interested in international relations. It's heavily international students within the course or domestic students who are going to be working in those spaces. And with that,
okay.
Brian.
So I want to begin by saying a little bit about my background because it informs this work. I'm from Toronto, Canada, and my first job out of getting my doctorate was with the Canadian Defense Department. As many of you might know, Canada has traditionally played a major role along with the Netherlands and other like-minded countries in the world of peacekeeping. And so I had an opportunity several times to visit our troops along with those of other nations, in particular in Cyprus and in the Golan Heights. And from this, 2 or 3 questions over time in these repeated site visits intrigued me as a newly minted PhD. And so the first was this idea of power asymmetry, and when you see it up close, how one of the sides has significantly more resources, has greater legitimacy at the United Nations, as a functioning society seems to work better than the other side, and try to understand then how that played out in terms of negotiation leverage with the United Nations in particular. What was your status in the club that allowed you to get certain things that the other side didn't easily have access to? The second, and it sort of relates to Mike's point about sort of getting to innovation, was the stuckness that parties found themselves in, although these are human beings separated by the so-called thin blue line, the blue helmets of the United Nations, but living worlds and cultures apart, and as if they were acting out tragic roles in a so-called Greek tragedy, found it very difficult, even with the UN as a mediator, to be able to have these discussions and to turn small issues into huge negotiation problems. And in fact, having an incentive to make the problem look worse from your perspective as a way of presenting oneself within a somewhat of a victimhood kind of frame. And the third piece that was interesting, because through the UN we had access to the domestic communities on both sides, how hard it is to find consensus, what we would call in negotiation, in your back table to make this thing called progress, because in international relations, making concessions can quickly be interpreted as a sign of weakness and you're giving up. In international relations and social psychology, there's a concept called judgmental overconfidence. And what it means is that being tough is doing well in international relations and negotiations. And you have this sense, if we just hang in one more day, the sun will come up tomorrow, the good Lord is on our side, we will persevere, we will prevail, and we will win. And it creates this kind of a cycle of stuckness that makes it very difficult for sides in what ultimately might become a negotiation to move forward. And so I've been interested in parties who are in conflict, who have difficulty moving off of dead center, and parties who, and this is the cross-cultural element for me that's been intriguing, who know what potential solutions are. In the Israel-Palestine context, for example, if I were to give a short one-page examination to everyone in this group, what does the ultimate deal look like? Everybody knows what the 4 or 5 main things are that the parties need to do to get there, but the parties refuse to go there. And so bringing both Western notions of rationality, our mental models, got me thinking in negotiation, is it possible that the parties who are ultimately involved in either peace-building relations or some form of that are not playing the same game as each other? And for a number of years, I think one of the central weaknesses in my teaching was that I was assuming sort of rational unitary actors on each side, and that they were hunting for solutions to what they were working on. And that raised for me as well this other question that relates to then my interest and growing interest in negotiation. Is it possible that the parties are coming together to do this thing called talking, discussing, but actually negotiating nothing? And that I started to call this ABA, anything but agreement, okay? So think about parties, international or domestic. Think here in the States of our own US Congress. There isn't a shortage of words exchanged there, okay? We do have the best Congress money can buy. And therefore, you engage in these endless discussions to make sure that you don't make any commitments that could hurt your particular side. So I started my career as an international relations person, sort of in the field. This raised a number of questions for me. Taught in a professional school of public policy and international relations, very similar to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy here. And then almost 30 years ago now, I came to the Kennedy School and started working in the area of international mediation, international conflict resolution, and from that, with the support of other colleagues, began to develop courses in negotiation analysis. And a critical term here, both often used at our business school with my colleagues there and at the Kennedy School in the tradition of Howard Rafa. I don't know how many of you sort of know that name. That negotiation has some very serious roots in some microeconomics. It has clearly roots in social psychology, and to give it more than just how do we learn to shake hands in negotiation. I want to speak quickly about my mandate at the school because this is important to what we're trying to do. I teach, and Mike was involved in the first iteration of this. I think you can remember that, about 2013. So Larry posed this question for you. Can you teach a little bit of what you're teaching and sort of make it a course, and it might fit into what other people are broadly doing? So I teach in a program that's called a Master in Public Policy program. People's second degree, folks in their mid-20s approximately have had 2 or 3 years some type of public service work experience. And the goal was to create an intensive, immersive experience and to do it in 6 weeks, okay, for 240 students, okay? So for the past half-dozen years or so, I've taught 4 sections of 60 person in a section, 4 days a week, a morning and a matinee, okay, every day. But here's what's important about this. The course, which I call under this sort of pedagogical theme, the term which you'll find easy to remember is ASAP. It stands for Accelerated Skill Acquisition and Performance, that I am trying to teach people in a short period of time, almost as we do here at PON in our executive programs. Give people, the course is called The Fundamentals of Negotiation Analysis, and to give them 2 particular sets of skills. I'm going to talk about the first set, which is developing the skill of providing negotiation analytic support, and in the fiction, to people who are at the table. So I used to make a mistake in my teaching by saying, you're going to graduate this June, and of course next fall you'll be Henry Kissinger. And so when we have had guests come to speak at the school who are very senior practitioners, students are seeing people who have been out in the field 20, 30 years and at the pinnacle of their career, and that's not going to be their next job, okay? And so what I'm trying to provide is first stage professional career development in a growing area in our field that I'm calling negotiation analytic support. And so part of what I'm trying to help people understand, some of the themes on the screen here, is to be able to learn about cases, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, that involve these elements, and then Monica will talk about operationalizing this analysis in the context of playing simulations. So the course has 2 pillars, an analytic piece and a behavioral piece, which is the simulation piece, okay? And so one of the things that I want you to do now is on your table you have, there's copies for you of this document. And so I want to take you through a bit of the framework piece of this. So my colleague Jim Sebanius and David Lax from the Harvard Business School developed a framework called 3D, 3 dimensions of negotiation, and critical from my life professional practice piece, working for the Canadian government with the UN, you saw that, and this is what drives this course, and for those of you in the international relations conflict resolution business, a great deal of the action of proposal formulation happens away from the table. And I used to, again, I have 247 different mistakes in my teaching, but one of them is that I was teaching as if it was sort of what Jim and David from their work would call the 1D tactical level. Here's what happened at the table. And what this course is about on the analytics side is lifting up the curtain about what happens before parties get to the table. And so in a moment I'll discuss this Iran nuclear deal case with you to take you through an example of what I do in this context. But basically, in a nutshell, the 3D framework helps people try to understand that coalitions, for example, which I know several people here are interested in, don't just happen at this place called the table. I don't just meet you in a forum like here and suddenly we're forming a coalition. That interests and concerns are articulated away from the table and formulated. You're trying to do some serious stakeholder mapping. You're trying to understand the issues at play even well before the parties come to the table. So the third dimension is about learning from an architectural perspective about the possibilities for the setup of a productive negotiation. I continually use a phrase in my teaching that Jim and David use in their book. What is it that stands between our side and our preferred deal today? What are all the barriers? So the 3D framework is about developing the skill of what's not right yet about the setup in terms of parties, in terms of issues, in terms of value creating potential on the table that needs to be restructured to make the likelihood of a deal increase, okay? The course is taught in a way, there's a course at Stanford University on design thinking. That's what this course is about. And another mantra from this key text that I use is the phrase, never accept the game as given, okay? And so my students, what's interesting, because Larry talked about this from a life skill development perspective, the central question in life that drives my students crazy, they're all trying to get jobs and interviews, and the employer says, this is the salary, the student is a bit surprised and wounded, and the employer says, it's company policy. And the phrase, it's company policy, applies in international relations as well. That's where the line is. No changes are possible. So the power of 3D from a design perspective, from an architectural perspective is, can we increase the likelihood of success if we backward map how we want to get to that deal and then sequence in the players and issues necessary to produce the secret sauce of an agreement. That's the essence of the 3D piece, okay? And so students in this 6-week intensive learning about how to develop the professional skill of providing this thing called negotiation analytic support to people more senior to themselves, that we work through a model here, a set of questions on 3D, 2D, and 1D. So if you turn the page, I say that the case that we're going to do this week is when negotiations turn nuclear and orchestrating a multi-front sanctions and negotiation campaign. So two things get raised here from an international relations perspective. The role of coercion in bringing parties to the table, that's what sanctions are about. And then I call it herding kittens with your UN Security Council members to keep them on board because they have different sets of interests, particularly around oil and finances with Iran. And so what I try to get students to do is appreciate both the coordination on one's own side or sides and to be able to bring pressure to bear and focus to bear on the target of influence, who in this case was the Iranian regime. And so each week, and this is what's key in this notion of accelerated learning, students are learning the vocabulary of the 3D framework over 5 cases. The little questions that refer to Iran are changed week to week. So I do a case on Charlene Barshevsky on trade in China. I do a case on George Mitchell in Northern Ireland. But this is the template in which they're starting to learn to ask good questions. And the professional skill from this is that when they go to an employer, whether it's public, private, or nonprofit sector, they have a bit of a framework and methodology to help people who are working on negotiation challenges work through the challenge in a systematic way. Okay? That's a central piece of what we're doing in this course. Okay, so what they get in class, okay, just try to work with this a bit. They get a list of the actors here, or we map the table, okay? So a key piece of the course is being able to draw on a piece of paper who is playing here today. So we put these players on the table, okay? And here comes the part about architecturally, how do you sequence players to be able to construct an agreement, okay? So I wanted you to just see this visually, because if you look on the next page, okay, what you're trying to see here, and this happens through rapid fire conversation and a fair bit of, does everybody know what cold calling is? Okay, in your classes? I've moved beyond that to frigid calling, but that's a separate discussion. So give me the order in sequence, I'm saying to students, in which, from the US perspective, they begin to put together the elements of this deal, all right? And so on the next page, okay, this is the Cliff's Note cheat sheet on how it was done. And what I want to understand with students is the importance of incremental scaffolding. So the question for you, and that's why I chose this case, because you can see it relatively quickly, is how does step 1 create possibilities, openings, and opportunities for step 2? How do 1 and 2 together create what's possible in 3? And you can do the additions to the rest of the case.
So On the screen, you'll see kind of what we think about when we think about these courses or how to package materials for students who are going to work in international relations in a negotiation class. The entire course is always grounded in experiential learning. So Brian already spoke about the use of cases, but we use simulations throughout. So role play simulations are used from your first day in the class, any negotiation class, through your last day. So that's not even on the screen here because everything, it's grounded in that type of learning. But these are the factors we think about. Can we put them in the course? How long is the course? Does it make sense to add these elements? How might we want to use them? So you'll see we ground the courses in micro skills. So what are the skills that we actually want students to get out of this that's particular to them, or in general, in negotiation skills that they need to have in order to succeed? We think about, do we want mediation and facilitation components? So especially in international relations, you're sitting at a table with 12 people, who's managing that conversation? Is there someone formally doing it, or does someone actually have to step up and do that? So how do we train students not to be necessarily formal mediators, but to understand process and to understand facilitation? How do we want to introduce those ideas into the course? We use the Thomas Kilmann instrument a lot for conflict analysis. It is a way of helping students understand what their approach personally to conflict is. So this is separate from thinking about international relations, but incredibly important for students to understand their triggers, how they respond to conflict in the moment at the table. To go back to the interesting conversation with Mike and Brian about acceleration and how we think about reflective practice, especially in short time frames, how much of that can we get in the class, right? So if we have more time, we want coaching, right? We want actually students to be able to talk to someone about what's going on in their performance and their strengths and weaknesses. We want have peer-to-peer feedback. So if you're doing a simulation or any sort of experiential learning, how are you getting feedback on what worked or the difference between the impact you're having on people and your intent? And then the last piece of this is journal writing. So if we have a very short time frame, how can we do structured, reflective questions to make sure that students are continuously reflecting on what we're doing in the classroom? So all of these pieces are in our heads regardless of this length. Brian spoke about a 6-week-long course. I work with faculty members who do semester-long courses. We do the 2-week course in January. We do 3-day trainings, 1-day trainings. All of these are kind of in our heads depending on the group we're working with. So jumping into this 2-week accelerated class specifically. So this runs in January. This is what Brian mentioned. It is a 12-day course, runs over 12 hours a day, at least 12 hours most days. And how do we think about it? So in week 1, these are all the things we want to make sure students are testing, are learning about, are being in exercises that push them in these directions, and we can have actual debriefing to advance the skill set in all of these factors, right? So we have negotiation fatigue, cognitive flooding, group decision-making biases, ethical dilemmas, cross-cultural differences, navigate shifting coalitional commitments and trade-offs, managing team and intergroup dynamics, engaging spoilers, generating consensus-based agreements. Now, the way we structure the class, like I said, is through a lot of simulations. So we see what we want to achieve, where we want to go, and how can we use role-play simulations to help students get to those skills, to put themselves in these scenarios where they're learning these things. In week 2 is actually when we introduce the idea of mediation and facilitation. So how do students think about mediating complex disputes, but then how can they also lead from any place at the table? So how can you develop these process leadership skills to help you in large, complicated scenarios with many stakeholders from different agencies, from different countries, different cultures at the table? And so in week 2, we add that dimension and then continue adding complexity in different ways. All right, so process control, joint and private caucuses with disputants. So we get a little bit more into how do you have sidebar conversations, how do you understand interests from different parties, whether you are a neutral mediator or you are actually a party with interests yourself. How to manage emotions, project credibility, navigate impasse, and generate options for sustainable agreements. And we use all of these ideas in the context of international relations, simulations, exercises, role plays. We already talked about casework, so I'll skip that one. Okay, so now we, like I said, use simulations. So when we think about simulations, in the class Brian talked about for the 6-week class, you'll see things on here maybe that you would teach in a lot of negotiation classes, right? So we do ones that are set in domestic cases, ones that are in the private sector, to build some of these foundational skills in students. A lot of these are available, most of these are available on the TNRC. So through the program on negotiation, you can order these. And the column all the way on the right is how many parties are in these. So we build in the level of parties to build some process complexity into the negotiations. By the time students get to this 2-week advanced class, things get more complicated. So these are on the left. These match the objectives that I already read off. And then these are the simulations that we use. And why we're showing this to you is you know what type of ideas you want to make sure are in your workshops, in your classes. These are some suggestions. Now, some of these, and what I'll talk about next, we designed specifically for this course, right? So how can we actually create simulations that reach the objectives we want to reach here? And in some cases, we just went and designed them. So what I'll talk about are 2 in particular that we've designed to reach these audiences, these students.
Okay, so hi everyone, welcome. My name is Toby Berkman. I am a senior associate at an organization called the Consensus Building Institute, or CBI. We are a nonprofit based here in Cambridge, and we do public sector dispute resolution. So I'm a mediator and a facilitator working on problems of collaboration, conflict, negotiation with folks in the public sector, typically. So public sector issues, anything from windmills being built in your town and you don't like it, to an ocean plan for the Northeast, to United Nations development project. So really kind of runs the gamut in my day job, but in my night job, or also often day job, I've been a lecturer here at Harvard Law School in the negotiation workshop. I've also worked as an associate in the negotiation and mediation clinical program. I teach courses here at the program on negotiation, so a seminar on negotiation and dispute resolution. So I think it's probably that latter affiliation that brings me here for this session. But in any case, really happy to be here and excited to talk a little bit about teaching negotiation to lawyers. So I'll maybe let Rachel introduce herself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Viscomi. I am the director of Dispute Systems Design Clinic here at Harvard Law School. And I'm an assistant clinical professor, so I teach a number of different courses, including multi-party negotiation, group decision-making, and teams, facilitation workshop, which we'll talk a little bit about today, which is leading challenging conversations in business, politics, and the community. And I lead clinical projects where students work together in teams to help clients engage issues of conflict that may come up organizationally, and thinking about how can they make better use of those conflicts. So super excited to be here with you today, super excited to be here with Toby, very excited to hear what he has to say, and looking forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Awesome. Okay, to just kind of kick things off, I'd love to get some of your thoughts on this question that's up on the screen here. Right, so what is different about negotiating as an attorney versus negotiating in other negotiation roles? Right, what do you all think is sort of different or distinctive about being a lawyer negotiator? Yeah.
When you're trying to be neutral and keep it so that you can both share ideas and how it's good outcome for both of you. When you're an attorney, you're continuing thinking in the back of your mind, well, what the judge say, what the judge say, what you can get. You need to let that go.
Yeah.
In order to really have negotiations that are right.
Yeah, I mean, so there is sort of both a reality that many of these negotiations are happening in the shadow of the law, but then also, a challenge as someone who's trained to think about that. How do I still focus on sort of the interpersonal dimensions, the interests, right? All the kind of good things we know about. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yep.
I have the opposite challenge. I find my students are very interested in all the things that don't involve the law. I have to remind them that there may be a little law in the background they have to keep in mind. So that's maybe the difference between the practitioner and the student.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. In the back there.
Well, I was an in-house counsel involved in several negotiations before becoming a professor. So in the back of my mind is not the judge, but what is the client? What is my client? What's my client's objective? rather than mine. And that's what I find a lot in trying to teach the students. Is it your objective or the client's objective? Right,
right. And how to kind of tease out when those might be in tension, right? And can we check yourself a little bit so that you're really working for the client? Great. So, I mean, I kind of, before this, just brainstormed a couple of differences. And I think that we've covered these and more, right? So, I mean, I think one big bucket of difference is around principal-agent issues, and those can come up in any number of different contexts, right? I mean, the lawyer's interests versus the client's are not identical, right? The lawyer's knowledge of the system, right, not identical to the client's. That can lead to tension and challenge. The lawyer's relationships, right? So they might have, you know, put more importance on relationships with co-counsel, potentially, than the client might. Or vice versa. Maybe the client puts more focus on the relationship with the counterparty than the attorney does. Your morals or ethical obligations as a lawyer, right, might be different. You, of course, are beholden to an ethical code of conduct that might be strange or unfamiliar to clients. So all of these are tensions that are specific to the lawyer role. And then I think another set of challenges that we heard just relates to the kinds of contexts in which lawyers are often engaged, right? So, of course, we're always negotiating in the shadow of the legal system. And often, right, and again, this might depend on if you're a litigator or a transactional attorney, but these are highly contentious distributive issues where there might be a fraught history that you need to manage. So I want to just say a little bit about specifically the unit in the negotiation workshop at Harvard Law School related to some of these issues. So in the workshop, we have three main kind of buckets of topics that we deal with sequentially over the course of this semester. So one is just kind of teaching the basics of negotiation 101, right? So this is how to create value, how to distribute value, right? The 7 elements, if you're familiar with the kind of the Fisherian model, right? That all goes into the first bucket or third of the class. And then we move to a unit on emotions, empathy, right? Interpersonal challenges, and sort of the fundamental book that we often deal with in that part of the course is Difficult Conversations by Heen, Patton, and Stone. And we do a whole bunch of exercises around that. And then this third unit around the principal-agent dynamic, I think is really specific to attorneys and to the law school. So a couple of the overall goals of that unit as I see them. So first of all, and I would say this goes throughout the course, right? But we always try to utilize what we would call a tell, show, do, review approach. So what does that mean? Essentially, it's first we will tell you kind of how to do something, so that could be in a lecture. Then we will, in fact, show you, so that could be through a demonstration by the instructors or some sort of a video or bringing up examples from practice that folks can see or read about. Then the students will have a chance to actually perform the skills through some sort of a role play or other exercise, and then we will debrief it, rinse, repeat. Right? That's sort of the basic structure of the workshop that I think works quite well in terms of engaging students and helping them understand and learn about specific skills. Another goal, as I see it, is to try to create some sort of a real-like experience around principal-agent tensions, right? So can we put in front of students cases that really grab them around different client interests or ethical dilemmas, right? Or real-like client-lawyer interactions, whether it be through actors or students playing the role of the client. And can we put them in really challenging scenarios that are complex, that have distributive elements, that have dispute elements to them, and have them think about opportunities to create value even within those dispute-like contexts. And I think kind of the fundamental thing that we're trying to teach them in this unit is that managing these principal-agent dynamics, right, is itself a negotiation. So everything you are learning about how to negotiate with the other side in two-party negotiations also applies to your interactions with your clients. And you need to be thinking about that and managing it and treating it just as seriously as you would the across-the-table negotiation. So just to give some examples of each of the kind of stages of tell, show, do, review, I'm going to show a couple of slides from sort of the tell. So from our plenary on client interviewing and counseling, right, here's just a list of goals when you're interviewing and counseling a client, right, what that looks like. So we'll put up this slide, and then later on we'll actually show them different client interviews and kind of have them debrief and think about them. From our plenary on ethics, right? So here's another version of a tell, right? So we talk about, so this comes from Bazerman and Tenbrensel's Blind Spots, which is a great book, talking about kind of the neuroscience behind ethical fading, right? So the idea that you have ethical commitments that you fully intend to follow through on, but then in the moment when you're actually faced with the ethical dilemma, you in fact don't. And there's all sorts of great research on how people have these ethical commitments that they believe in the abstract, and then they in fact do not follow through in the moment, and then when you talk about it with them afterwards, they will not really recollect even that they did not in fact follow their ethical commitments. So the book talks about sort of the difference between a should self, which is sort of the self that is thinking ahead and identifying ethical commitments and fully intending to follow through on them, and then the want self, which is the self that is actually faced with the ethical dilemma in the moment, and how those selves don't always align, and in the moment of decision, the want self sort of takes over. So we want to give them tell them some advice for how to address that. So, for example, beforehand, can you make ethical dilemmas part of your preparation? In the moment, can you get help from the balcony? So maybe talk to a colleague or kind of take a step back and try to activate your should self, right? Your broader thinking self. And then can you afterwards engage in critical reflection and review, right? So again, this is the tell version of what we do, right? We're just kind of putting this information out there because it's interesting, but it's not enough, clearly, right? So we also need to show them what these things look like in practice. So we have a video that we use that shows Professor Mnookin basically interviewing basically shows lawyers engaged in client interviews and how they negotiate those client interviews, and then Professor Mnookin coaching those lawyers on how to do it more effectively. And there are a number of different versions of this in the video, and you can see different approaches that different attorneys are using towards the client interview, right? So this is the show for client interviews. For the ethical piece, right, the kind of ethics, we have a role play that kind of really teases out some of the issues very nicely that I'll talk about in a moment. And we also provide examples from real life practice. So here is a letter that Mark Perlmutter, an attorney down in Texas, sends. And this is an example of how can you, when thinking about ethical issues, sort of prepare and pre-commit yourself, in a sense, to behaving ethically. So this is a letter that they send to opposing counsel, basically trying to get buy-in from both sides to behave ethically. So an example, a clear example to students of what some of the skills we're teaching might look like in practice. All right, yeah, please. Yeah, do you know about this? I don't know, it's a great question. If you are interested in some of these specific materials, you're very welcome to email me, and I can give you some of that, right? Absolutely. Okay, so then, the do and the review. The do is basically role play exercises. So we have a number of 2-level role play games. We have some in which the students are playing attorneys, one in which we actually bring in actors to do that. And each of these teases out a different lawyer-client challenge. And then finally, of course, when we review, that's the review piece, right? We allow them to debrief both with their clients and with counterparties so they get feedback from everyone involved. Okay, so that's a kind of broad overview of the curriculum and how we kind of use the tell, show, do, review approach. I wanted to dig in a little bit specifically on what we have found to be both a very rewarding part of this curriculum, but also a challenging one. One that I think we've struggled with over the years on how to deal with effectively. So here are 3 role-play exercises that are currently in play in the negotiation workshop. So one is a role-play called United States versus Teller. This is a new role-play, and I'm going to talk a little more in depth about it, because this is sort of, I think, one of the question marks that we have. But essentially, this is a criminal plea negotiation that involves principal-agent tensions. Students are playing both lawyers and clients. Then we have another role play that teases more ethical issues out. So this is called the Don's negotiation. It's a civil settlement negotiation. Again, students as lawyers and clients. And then finally, Ellsworth versus Ellsworth, which is a divorce negotiation. And in that case, we actually bring in actors to play the husband and wife, or the partners, actually, we leave it gender ambiguous, who are getting divorced. Okay, so United States versus Teller, I want to talk in a little more depth, because I think it actually really pulls out what I think is a kind of challenging and really important issue in how you teach this stuff. So I mentioned kind of at the outset, one of the goals of this unit is we want to try to make the principal-agent tension real for students. Actually have them experience something that feels fraught to them, right? That kind of gets at them. So they're not, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of kind of this case author, but regardless of whether you heard about it, for me, it's one of my favorite cases. We use it in emotions, and the reason that it works so well is students actually get emotional in this case, inevitably. It just raises the level of emotion, and it's fantastic, because then you can debrief that afterwards, and it feels very real and authentic. They actually got angry. How did you deal with it? So we want to have something similar with respect to the principal-agent tension, where they really feel it, and they don't know what to do, and they are stuck. So we have this case, US v. Teller. It's relatively new, and you can see up there some of the principal-agent tension. So just a little bit of background. The case is a criminal defendant who is being basically, it's sort of based loosely on the Oklahoma City bombings, and basically this person has been accused of being part of a conspiracy to bomb a federal office building. This person is affiliated with a white supremacist group, and is obviously accused of very serious crimes. There's also a potential hate crime charge that could be brought against them. And the 4 roles are someone actually playing this defendant, the public defender who's representing them, the U.S. attorney, who's sort of the principal on the other side, and then the assistant U.S. attorney, the AUSA, who's actually the one trying the case and engaged directly in the plea negotiation. So we have, first of all, a session where we coach the actors, right? So the students playing clients are essentially actors, right? They're not negotiating. We kind of ask them to play a role. And then the lawyers, we kind of talk to them about how to manage the principal-agent tension. And then we actually have them meet with their clients, so each side meets separately, and then the 2 lawyers meet and negotiate away from the clients. And they can also go meet with the clients during that. Some things come up in the cross-the-table negotiation, and then we debrief. So key elements of the case that really kind of make the principal-agent challenge rise up to the surface. So for the assistant U.S. attorney, we've written the roles. So essentially, the U.S. attorney is insisting that you secure a plea deal that includes a hate crime charge. The reality is you do not think that this is justified. The evidence that a hate crime charge would be based on is very likely inadmissible. But your boss is insisting that you put it in there, largely for political gain, because he or she has political aspirations. And he tells you explicitly, or they tell you explicitly, that you will not get a promotion if you don't comply with the instructions. Right? So it creates a very fraught dynamic. You do not believe that this is justified. Your boss is telling you you have to do it. On the other side, So the client, so teller, right, has a history of racially motivated crimes and is affiliated with a domestic hate-based terrorist organization. You, as the attorney, you don't believe that the evidence supports the hate crime charge, but you do believe your client is likely guilty, and you're just very, very unsympathetic to them, obviously, right? You found their ideology and behavior to be abhorrent, right? And I think that's one of the purposes of the case, is to put the challenge in front of the students. So the reality is actually both clients have more sympathetic backstories, and I won't get into it in too much detail, but one of the takeaways of the case that we hope students will get from it is if they are able to build trust with their clients through an effective lawyer-client negotiation, information surfaces that both kind of helps them understand where the client is coming from, right, and also get new information that makes them more effective in the across-the-table negotiation. But we're very clear with the students playing the clients, don't give this information unless this person does a really good job building rapport with you. So that's the layout of the case, and I want to talk specifically about the public defender role, because I think that is the one that I would say is most fraught and most potentially challenging, because you have students representing someone that, by all accounts and based on their instructions, is an incredibly unsavory character. And that's one of the purposes of the case, but also one of the challenges, right? So for many students, I would say this is one of the highlights of the semester, this role play. They experience it as very challenging, but also very rewarding and memorable, because they actually have an experience of being very, very turned off by their client, very, very uninterested in listening and learning about this person, right? And particularly if they're in the public defender role, actually there's an opportunity for some level of understanding, if not sympathy, right? On the other hand, this public defender role is very differentially challenging for students, right? So it may trigger feelings of exclusion or inequity. So I just put up a quote there from one of my students who very politely came to me after the class where we debriefed this. And she was in the public defender role. She was an African-American woman. And she said, listen, if you're going to use this case, right, you really need to think carefully about how are you going to manage this debrief where you have a person of color as a lawyer for a white supremacist. I mean, it sounds completely obvious when you say that, right? And for me, it was actually quite a moment, right? I mean, I, was very much like, yeah, wow, you are absolutely right. I mean, yes. And it's not like this hadn't occurred to me beforehand, but I don't think that we've done enough to really think through this element of it. Folks feel like there is sort of value to making these sorts of experiences for students. And I think also, though, if you do so, right, creating a space for different choices, right, and part of the lesson around, understanding your own boundaries, and that we're not saying you need to be a zealous advocate for every person, right? Also making sure that there's space in the room to really process these things, whether that be through, the personal reflection piece, right, and bringing that in, right, or whether it be through just making sure that the debrief really has the space to talk about the personal experiences that people had and reflection time, right? But you can't just do this and have a 15-minute debrief and expect that it's going to be okay, right? So thank you. Really, really enlightening conversation for me, and hope for you as well. I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Rachel.
Take the microphone from the chair. I can pull it up. Awesome, thank you. So I love getting to talk about this on the heels of that conversation, because there is so much richness that I think really connects to the issue that I wanted to talk about. So Toby sort of started us off by thinking and inviting you all to think a little bit about what is different about negotiation from a legal perspective. And one of the things that I want to invite us to think about is what is the same, in the sense that We, I think, in law school can sometimes have a tendency to have a real myopic focus on a very small subset of legal skills, right? We think a lot about our analytical power. We think a lot about what zealous advocacy looks like. We think a lot about the courtroom. We think a lot about persuasion. All of those are critical, right? Critical lawyering skills. One of the things that is continuously struck home to me, though, about lawyers is that they're also humans. And as such, one of the things that is really powerful in the way that we interact is that we are moved by, driven by, characterized by strong emotions. And despite the fact that I think sometimes law school can set up can sort of operate from the assumption that it's possible to separate those things, we know very well that in fact it's not, right? We can't separate our decision-making capacity from our emotional capacity. We can't pull those things apart. And we really can't be effective lawyers if we're not capable of both engaging with our clients' emotions, our counterparties' emotions, right? Our opposing counsel's emotions, our own emotions, right? And lawyers do things that go well beyond representing clients in traditional cases, right? Lawyers work on committees, lawyers run meetings, lawyers collaborate and offer policy solutions and advocate for legislation and do all kinds of things. And in each and every one of those things, how we engage with emotion is really important. So I want to play a little bit with, or I want to share a little bit about how we exercises and approaches that we use to help engage with emotions in a particular context. So this is the facilitation workshop class that I mentioned before. It is an advanced negotiation course, which means that students have to have taken the negotiation workshop before they come to us. So they've spent 110 hours doing the things that Toby described and really thinking about what does it look like to start to move away from that really positional mindset? What does it look like to understand that my perspective in negotiation is a construct? It's something that comes from me looking at individual pieces of data and building a set of assumptions and interpretations and reaching a conclusion that might be quite different than the conclusion that someone else in my shoes might reach, and might be quite different than the conclusion that the person next to me reaches, right? So, so they come in with that skill set. It's a very small class. It's application, 12 students. And what we do over the course of the semester is to provide them a lot of opportunities to facilitate conversations. So they get to be participants in conversations. So like with respect to the Teller case that we were talking about moments ago, one of the benefits of having a student play the client is that the student has really powerful observations about how did I feel? Did I feel heard, listened to, respected, supported? And those lessons for lawyering from the client's shoes are very powerful lessons. Same thing is true in the context of facilitation. When I raise something that feels really important to me, I have a lot of reactions to the way that somebody else, whether that's another participant in the facilitation or the person who's leading the conversation, reacts and engages, right? So there's a lot of fertile ground there. So I'll say more about sort of how we design some of those opportunities. But one of the reasons I wanted to focus on emotion is that I think it is a given in a lot of ways, right? So this is a quote that's from Lisa Feldman Barrett. She wrote How Emotions Are Made. So even though I will read it to you because I'm not sure if anybody else needs reading glasses, but so the bottom line is this. The human brain is anatomically structured so that no decision or action can be free of interoception, which is our awareness of emotions as they arise in our body, and affect, so how they show up on our face or in our behavior. No matter what fiction people tell themselves about how rational they are, Your bodily feeling right now will project forward to influence what you will feel and do in the future. It is an elegantly orchestrated, self-fulfilling prophecy embodied within the architecture of your brain. So one of the things that we want to normalize for students is your job as a lawyer isn't to figure out how not to feel things, right? Your job as a lawyer isn't to persuade your clients not to feel things or to tell them to disregard those things because they're not relevant to the case. So one of the analogies I like to use with them is water, right? Emotions can be very much like water. When we're attuned to them, when we expect them and we anticipate them and we're open to them and we're willing to feel them, right? They can flow in a way that is really helpful and harmonious and enables us to do more effectively a lot of the things that we need to do. When we fight them and we try to dam them and block them off, they can break through dams, they can destroy cities, they can ruin client relationships, right? So it isn't so much, do we want to engage with them or not, right? It's, we need to engage with them one way or another. Can we do that in a way that's thoughtful and powerful and gives us the benefit of that? These are lessons that, of course, we all know in our own lives, and sometimes for students who have been knee-deep in thinking about torts and property and crim and have not had a lot of opportunity to really think about some of the engaging with clients and engaging particularly in really challenging contexts can feel counterintuitive, right? Because they feel like this kind of runs against what they've been learning in terms of what's relevant. Is there a case or a controversy? What are the facts? What are the elements, right? And if it doesn't fit in those buckets, it's not always top of mind. So how do we try to trigger some of these things or think about and give them some opportunities to engage with these ideas in class? So I picked a couple features that I think help. So one, of course, is case studies, and I'm going to talk about one of them in particular. But we do a combination of simulations, as many of you were talking about in the context of a negotiation class, where you have a set of instructions that give you a role, and you are coming and you are playing that role to the best of your ability. We also do facilitations in which we ask students to bring themselves, right? So they do a facilitation in the second class of the course that is about identity at HLS. So what are the ways in which you feel you can show up authentically here on campus? What are the parts and pieces of your identity that resonate, that you feel like you can fully express? What are the ways in which you can't or you feel impeded from doing so? What are the places in which you feel seen? What are the ways in which you don't? That's an example. There are other opportunities, but thinking about like how do I actually show up as myself and what are the emotions that come up for me in that context? We have students facilitate actual business meetings, so of local businesses where they are terrified in some cases, right? Because they know very little about the context that they're going into, and they are not sure that they have the skills to really be helpful, so there's some managing of their own emotions in that context, in possibly all contexts. A new thing that we introduced this year is campus conversations. So we're very interested in not just equipping our students with some of the skills to engage emotion effectively, but also in helping them have a level of comfort with the notion that they can actually take proactive measures in situations where there are conversations about which there is a lot of fraught emotion, to think about, as a person who has a certain set of skills, is there something that I can do structurally to engage these questions and to bring people together and to try to help people see some of this conflict as an opportunity to learn more about how different people are seeing these conversations or whatever the issue at hand is. So one of the things we did this year was to have each student identify a topic that they thought was important to have a conversation about on campus. and then to convene that conversation, to pick a date and a time and to solicit participants and to structure the agenda and to meet with us to think it through and to engage it. We had students who engaged conversations around gentrification, around sexual assault, and how we integrate people back into society, or if we do after the fact. We had students convene conversations around the protests in Hong Kong. We had students convene conversations around public interest drift and the ways in which law schools, many law students come in with a particular vision of how they'll practice after law school and what shifts over time, and an assortment of other topics, but things that for them felt important. We have them at the end of the semester engage in Capstone Conversations. So we invite folks from the community who have an interest in having conversations with people with really different views to come for 3 sequential weeks. The students are paired up in groups of 3. So each week, one set of 2 students facilitates and the third observes and takes notes. Everything is videotaped. And this semester, we had 2 separate sort of streams of topics. So one group of participants spent 3 weeks talking about immigration policy, and the other group of 2 groups of participants spent 3 weeks talking about gender and Me Too. And so, again, they're members of the community, they're folks the students aren't familiar with, who have very, strong ideas and strong thoughts, not just about the topics, but also about how they're running their groups. And so they have an opportunity to really think about how do we engage with each of these things. We do a lot of videos and observation, and we do incorporate a lot of journal writing, right? Which gives them an opportunity to really think about. When I go back and I watch my video, we had actually just such a charming moment the other day in class where there was a very emotional, there was a participant in an immigration conversation who made an extremely emotional comment about her personal experience and how that informed her thought on it. It was a very intense comment. And the student who, the student responded, and we watched this video moment in class, and he said, okay, so we're going to move on to the next topic, mostly for reasons of time. And so as we watched the clip in class, which his observer colleague had chosen, and each student sort of sets up, here's why we're going to watch this comment, or here's why we're going to watch this moment, and here's the feedback that might be helpful. So we watched the moment, and the student who had said it says, that's less acknowledgement than I remember.
Suskind, I'm on the faculty at MIT. I teach urban and environmental planning. And while I'm also at the program on negotiation and focus on negotiation, a lot of my practice concerns interventions in communities trying to help resolve multi-party disputes over public policy questions. And certainly questions of climate adaptation are multi-party policy disputes that raise difficult questions for people in communities that disagree or have very different levels of interest in concern about what the effects of climate change might be on their community. And what I want to do is set up a particular project that we've worked on with a number of coastal communities in New England. It goes back a couple years when we started it. And the question was how to help people in a coastal city or town get to the point of feeling optimistic about their ability to work with other citizens and with city government and with industry about doing something in light of what the effects of climate change are likely to be in that city. And what I'm going to be focusing on is the design of a role-play simulation to run in the city, not just in a college or university or just for the leaders at a meeting of the Board of Selectmen or something like that. So it's a little bit of a different question. I'm asking, how do we use role-play simulations to bring a whole community, could be hundreds of thousands of people in a community, to a point where they can better work together to generate a shared idea of the strategies they should adopt to adapt, okay? And the role-play simulation that we designed was fitted to one community, and we did that 4 times with 4 different coastal communities in 4 states. So we didn't use the same game. We changed the game to highlight the issues that were really on the agenda in the community where we were working at the time. So it's a very important point in the design of role-play simulations, how tightly fitted to the circumstance do you need to be if you're trying to help the people in a particular circumstance learn enough about how they can negotiate with each other or work together to achieve agreement. And we answer that question by saying the closer you can be to the details of the situation, the better, even though there's downsides to that, which I will come to. So we began in each case by getting an invitation from the chief elected officials in the community. We didn't just show up and say, we've got some research we want to do, or we want to help. We had a contract with each community. We had funding from a federal agency that's supposed to be helping coastal communities. And we said, this is what we wanted to do with some of the funding, and we were given some support to do that. This project goes by the name New England Climate Adaptation Project, affectionately known as NECAP. And if you want all of the information about everything that I'm saying, you can go to localclimatechange.mit.edu, and you can get everything that I'm going to describe for 4 different communities in 4 different states with 4 different games. But I'm just going to use one, which was from Rhode Island, to illustrate in the next hour here. So we get an invitation. We say, we're not asking you for any money. We have a student team. We're going to come and do this work. First thing we want to do is talk to a lot of people and understand what the prevailing views are about the climate risks that the community is facing, whether informed by science or not, whether one political view or another, we don't care. We're going to interview a cross-section of people privately, in person, confidentially, not for attribution. We're not doing a survey. And we ask people that we talk to suggest other people we should talk to. We start with a list of organizations. We ask public officials who they say they're hearing most from. And we do what in the business would be called a stakeholder assessment. And we prepare a written summary of that assessment and send it to everyone we interviewed and say, you don't see your name here, but does this look like it includes at least your view? And do you see yourself, without your name being mentioned, in the map of conflicts over climate impacts in the future, present and future, in this city? We then go from that case history, that stakeholder assessment, to the design of a simulation. The simulation, we have to decide, well, what are the characters we want to have in the simulation, and what's the premise of the simulation? Some group of people talking about what to do in a place with regard to climate risk. But more specifically, what questions do we want them to be looking at? What options, in terms of possible answers to the questions, do we want them to be considering? What information do they need collectively and individually in the roles that they're assigned to play those parts realistically? And we took detailed data from a climate impact assessment for each community developed with colleagues whose business that is. That's what they do. They do forecasts. Not big regional forecasts, which is what mostly those of us in the climate business have. They downscale that assessment to a particular place. And there are questions about how accurate you can be when you do that, but that is a thing. Downscaled, municipally oriented climate impact forecasts. So you'll say, in the next 10 years, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, what's going to happen to temperature? What's going to happen to precipitation? What's going to happen with storm intensity? What's going to happen with whatever factors you think are important to model local changes in climate that will have an adverse effect? What are the flooding risks? And we use that forecast in the development of the game, of the role play, so that the people in that community, while they were playing a game, were learning about and dealing with the actual forecast, scientific and technical forecasts for that place, okay? And you can raise all kinds of questions about, do you need to go to that length to make a game to teach people some general principles about climate adaptation? But as I finish the story, you'll see why we felt that was very important. So then we have this game. We test it with students at MIT to make sure it's playable in roughly the time length that we were thinking of, which was about an hour. After you read it and before we talked together, literally an hour of play of the game. And then we started tracking different organizations in the community saying, would you be willing to invite your people to come to an evening in which dinner will be provided and childcare will be provided, and anybody who wants to come can come, and the goal will be in an hour to play a game and in a half hour to have a discussion of it. And of course, we were attempting to be strategic about the distribution of groups we were asking to participate. So there were environmental advocacy groups, there was the Chamber of Commerce, there was members of the local Wetland Commission, there were people from public service, people who are employed by the city government, different industries. We're asking them to send people, but you don't know who you're going to get. And so however many people signed up, we got a space and set them at tables of 6. So we would try to distribute them without telling them to make sure that all weren't friends sitting at the table from the same organization. And then we needed to give them some time to re-review the material, because when someone signed up, we sent them most of the background material, and all they needed to read when they showed up were the confidential instructions for the role that they were being asked to play that evening. And we had lots of people who said, but that's not what I do. I want the other role. I want to be, no, we're saying that's not in the cards tonight. You have to be your own worst nightmare tonight, and that's the way this works. Almost everybody accepted it. Nobody left because they couldn't be themselves or who they wanted in the game. We played the game, we debriefed the game, and we took the results of all the tables, wrote an analysis of them, and then met with all the elected officials and summarized for them what people thought were possible actions that they could reach agreement on at all the tables. And we had the media at the sessions with the elected folks. And we had our written summary in a press release form, as well as a more detailed summary form for anyone amongst the elected officials who wanted to see it. Okay? So that's the story, and I'm going to zoom in on the game itself. As you might imagine, people who have their doubts whether climate change is a risk, and this was a couple years back, but you know, such folks are still very much out and about. didn't like the fact that it showed all the imagery of the aerial view of what happened when Sandy attacked, the storm attacked New England. They didn't like the fact that it was so certain what the effects were going to be, but we went ahead with this. The good news is we had no problem getting 60 to 80 people from each place with the distribution across. We went through all of this, got the results, did each of 4 places. And then the question became, do the people willing to play a role-play simulation in a community reflect the distribution of people in that community adequately, or are you just getting a biased set of people already leaning toward a view of the problem and appropriate action? So this is what the general instructions look like for the particular game. Again, this is just to give you a flavor of things, but you can see any and all of this material in comprehensive form on localclimatechange.mit.edu. And so it does require at least a high school education to read this material and prepare to play the game. If I were to do a grade school version of it, it would be very simple, much simpler. I think we can do that, but this is aimed at least people who've graduated from high school in terms of the language and the material. And this is what confidential instructions look like. The general everybody gets. The confidential instructions, there are a series of specific questions with a map of a place. The map has got different names on it, but it looks a lot like the shape of the place in Cranston. The issues are the issues in that place that came out of that stakeholder assessment. So they're given material and they're told, in your position, the role that you're in, this is where you stand on each of these issues, and you can't just say, I personally think differently, and I'm going to act the role differently in the game. I mean, we can't make somebody do it, but we make such a big deal about being consistent with your assigned roles that my feeling is, having been present for all of these, that the people did that. They stayed within the role. Some of them had a really good time with it. If it wasn't their real life role, they went over the top, playing the role the way they think someone who they don't like would play the role. The case study of the place looks like this, so about 30 pages, and it's presented in a way where we take the results of the stakeholder assessment and the results of the downscaled study, neither of which that city had, and neither of which had paid for, but which were part of our background work in order to get to this point to make the game. And this piece is one of the few published in peer-reviewed journal that says games change people's minds. Because we had the before you played the game answers to questions, and the after you played the game questions, and the 6 weeks after you played the game personal interview with 20% of the participants to see if which way do you even remember how you answered the question, what do you think now? And we found that as a result of participating in this 1-hour game and a half-hour debriefing and a half-hour preparation, that people had a very different sense of, can local governments do anything? Can they and should they do anything relative to climate risk? And people became much more optimistic that it was worth talking about because there's now some things they could see that cities could do preparatorily to make the effects less bad, and some things they could do to harden some of their infrastructure There were things they could do about even thinking about moving certain public facilities away from areas most likely to be flooded now that they were clear where the flooding would be when the flooding got worse. So their level of optimism about being able to do anything, their willingness to talk about needing to do something, their sense that local officials had some role to play. Because in the beginning, when you ask people, what can their city do about climate change, the vast majority of people, regardless of the demographics, say nothing. This is some global thing. It's going to get us. What can we do? And it was a substantially statistically significant shift across all levels of education, across most political perspectives, certainly across political party identification. There was a small set of participants, maybe 5%, who are climate deniers, who came, who participated, and whose opinions didn't change in any way from participating in this event. But of the other 95% of people who participated, and again, we had an accurate profile of all the people in the community, there was a substantial shift in people's sense of optimism and purpose, and their sense whether or not people with different views, because we asked very specifically, do you think people with different views about climate change can come to some agreement about what the city should do? And before, the answer was no way, and after was more than a majority said yeah, because that's what happened in the group. And of course, we were modeling in the groups what happens if you add a facilitator to what would normally be the kind of raucous town hall public hearing that we showed you a tiny bit of. But this was, you're sitting there, people from all different groups in a studied conversation, having prepared a little bit, each of them, with a facilitator helping them work through an agenda of issues with options under the issues laid out, and can you reach a consensus? And they were very able to do that.
All right. I'm going to get started with the lunch presentation. Let me introduce myself. All right. Thank you. So my name is Neeraj Kumar. I'm the founder of iDecisionGames.com. And I've had quite a path to get towards negotiation and working with negotiation professors, because I used to not do anything like that. I'll tell you a little bit about my journey and how I got started doing this. I graduated from MIT with an MBA in 2005. And while I was there, I actually cross-registered at Harvard and took a class an econ class at HKS, which had about 100 students there. And they taught a negotiation case. And it was two-party, distributive. They handed out some paper instructions, and then you negotiated, found your counterpart somehow within the 100 people, negotiated, you entered your results on a piece of paper, and you handed those results out to your TA. And then the TA, poor TA spent a bunch of time putting those results into a spreadsheet, and they didn't have enough time to do it in that session. So they showed you the results in the next session, which was 2 days later, by which point I'd already sort of forgotten what the exercise was about. So I thought, this is kind of weird. Maybe I should do something about it. But then I was like, well, I'm just doing my MBA. I should go work in finance. So I went to work in finance. And then fast forward, many years later, I'm doing an executive leadership training at Goldman Sachs. And there's a great professor who comes in from Columbia Business School, and he does a leadership case, which actually was really a negotiation case, and the same exact experience. 60 people in a room, and no technology at all. He did a really good job. He was very effective, very good. But when I was looking at it, I was going, I want some data. I want to see what different people in the room are thinking. How do I compare to those people? And there was none of that data available. You were raising your hand and you were getting some information, but nothing qualitative or nothing quantitative at all. And then the other part of it that was strange to me was that you didn't really get any feedback on your results. So you did that great executive training, and then you walked away and got busy with work and just forgot about that training completely. I wanted that to be on my phone and to be, provided some reminders or see the debrief and see my results and compare those results. And so, what did I really want? I wanted to be able to see things like this Pareto efficient chart, where I wanted to know how did I perform against the rest of the class. So if you don't know what this one is doing, it's just showing a Pareto efficient line showing what is the best outcome that you could have. And it also shows a very interesting viewpoint, which is you could improve your counterpart's outcome without getting worse if you moved in along the axis. And something like that is really valuable at a place like Goldman Sachs because you'd be surprised, but internally it's all about collaboration and they reward you on that. Your bonus is based on how well you perform in a team. And as you perform across different groups, they want to value people who are encouraging good behavior. And so this exercise could have been so much more effective, I thought, if those insights were provided to me in a way that I could consume them and keep them for the future. I wanted to see things like, do first offers predict negotiation outcomes? This is from a real case, and of course, it depends on the case, depends on the exact negotiation, but in this particular case, there was a positive trend line. How did I do compared to others? Like the orange shows me my score versus the rest of the class. How did I do versus everyone else if I bucket them into a histogram? Though, if I did really well, right, and I did really well in the negotiation quantitatively, did I damage the relationship? So this particular chart is showing what is the feedback from your counterparts by doing it two ways. You could either do it per exercise and then aggregate it so that there is anonymity of your counterparts. And that way, the instructor can choose that. But the counterparts can also rate you across several dimensions. This one is looking at the relationship dimension, and you want to know whether you did well or not. Did you score really well on that outcome but damage the relationship, or still preserve the relationship, or preserve any of the other metrics that are important as a teaching point? This one is interesting if you know the fish pond lane case. It's about the sale of a house, and why are birds in this word cloud when you ask students to talk about what was important in the exercise. But if you don't know the case, then I can tell you about it later. Another personality assessment. This to me was quite interesting as a concept. When I took the MBTI test, the Myers-Briggs, in undergrad, I was an INTP, so introvert. And then when I took it again in business school, I had switched to being an extrovert. And I think this was because I knew that if I needed to be effective in selling, I needed to derive energy from talking to people, from interacting with people, and not just from staying at home and reading books and thinking about the best way of doing something. So knowing where you are compared to your peers, this is again a histogram, and the orange line shows where I am compared to the rest of my class. The next step from this could be, what if you take that data, and as Larry was mentioning earlier, benchmark against all the other classes at MIT Sloan, or all the other business schools, or all the other people who are using the platform across all time, and see what that looks like? We're in the process of building that feature. So anyway, so this is the type of stuff that I wanted to see, but it wasn't available. So what did I do? I left Goldman Sachs, and I started working on the iDecision Games platform. In the first time I tried to get people to use it, it was very challenging. People were very, they wanted to run the cases the way they'd always run them. They didn't want to use any technology. I managed to get 3 professors interested, and I said, this is good enough. This is worth leaving Goldman for. So I did that, and then luckily we grew, and now we have 15 of the top 20 schools using the platform. Overall, over 150 professors use it. We, on our platform, offer exercises from a variety of platforms or libraries. And all of the Harvard PON exercises are available to teach using the platform. And in addition, we've now taken the next step of enhancing those materials so that by default, when you teach a case, and hopefully this will get rid of the hesitancy of using a new case, you get everything pre-packaged for you. And what does that mean? You get the teaching materials which are enhanced. You get slides which you can just debrief with directly. You get the pre-negotiation surveys or a version of that you can customize if you wanted to, already available directly. You get the outcome forms, the post-negotiation surveys already available without having to do anything. The charts and all the visualizations that are appropriate for each case are pre-created for you. In the future, this feature is coming soon, is you can interactively benchmark against other classes that you use the same case in, or other professors that are running it, or in general, benchmark against the entire data set that we have.
Yes, my friends? Let's not punish those who are on time, right? So that's a good way of starting. So welcome. My name is Alain Lempereur. I'm a professor at Brandeis University and also an affiliated faculty at the program on negotiation. And I'm very happy to be sitting here, or sitting or standing or sitting with my longtime friend James, because James and I, we have been doing this program abroad for now many years. And I think that I always look, I mean, we have done some demos together of some of these skills that I still have in my memory. So let me tell you what my hope is, if I find my remote control. I know I must have had it somewhere. Oh, there it is. So my hope is to do a very short historical overview of the video used at PON, and also tell you more afterwards about the program on negotiation that is called PON Global, that was put in place a few years ago, that will use intensively videos. So, and I've tried to identify 8 video strategies that could be used in classes. And I will finish with impact of videos on negotiation pedagogy and some lessons for negotiation trainers. I guess that if you remember, you have been here, many of you, for many years. We have been using videos at PON for many years. I mean, if you don't know about this, but there are so many wonderful scenes in Erin Brockovich. Scenes of listening or active listening. You have extraordinary scenes also in Jerry Maguire. Some of them cannot always be talked about, but they are fantastic. In Love Actually, in Star Trek. And it's sometimes a few minutes of video really tell a story that is worth a speech. So we have loved doing that, demonstrating theory in action. Of course, you probably know about this vintage video that some of us are still using, part of it, the one where Roger Fisher is involved in advising a client on another probably simulation you have used too, called Power Screen. So this is what we have been doing. We have also, and thanks to Susan Hackley, our executive director, have had a PON film series. A few years ago, I showed this extraordinary documentary called All Friends at the Bank. Does anyone know about this? Oh, I tell you, this is a fantastic documentary about negotiation between the World Bank and the government of Uganda, and you could see entering these real, it's a documentary, real negotiation scenes between the protagonists within the Uganda government, between the World Bank and the IMF, some of the tensions. Because we're also looking for real footages of negotiation, not so easy to find. And I think many of us have also used probably YouTube videos. YouTube videos are ways of condensing in 5 minutes what sometimes we would present in PowerPoint during 20 minutes. I think it's a great exercise. So it's really building on what we have already been doing, but I want to tell you more about PON Global. That's the new executive educational program that is offered worldwide. I don't know exactly, Brianna is there, how many countries it has been offered so far. 15 already, right? And James and I, we have been in some countries together, really enjoying some of our work. And I think also the two driving forces behind this program are Guhan Subramanian, who is the new program on negotiation chair, and also Susan Hackley, who has been really, she's a movie director herself, but she has really been good at supporting us in this work. Without the two of them, I don't think we would have been able to put the following together. Believe it or not, and we have here 5 hours, 17 minutes of 15 core videos, 13 suggested, 22 additional, 4 supplemental. So we are talking about, if I'm correct, 8 hours, 40 minutes of videos. So guess what? We will never use in a course these 8 hours, 40 minutes. But that's good, because the moment you know what they are, you could use them at the right time. And that's really what we are trying to do. And it's not simply about the quantity of videos. It's also trying to identify what are the different strategies that we could, on how we use these videos, and what are the different ways of using them. So they are used for introduction, they are used for lectures, for insights. We're also using cartoons that are used both for lecture and insights, demo videos, using them for teaching, to understand how you teach some aspects of this course, also for panels, and even a case. So these are 8 examples of how you could use videos in PON Global. Let me go through these 8 video strategies. Introductory video. So it's really presenting what the model of PON Global is, what these 3 days, how these 3 days develop. Insisting on why did we have to put these so many videos together, because we really wanted to offer quality in the conception of these videos, monitoring of their use, and also evaluating how they come across with the different publics. So globally, that's why it's called PON Global. It's the same theories, the same concepts, the same tools provided by the different PON faculty. But then locally, you have like PON trained instructors who will be there who know these theories, these concepts and tools, and will use some of these videos on site. And of course, we continue to use, of course, the simulation and the discussions that are led by the local instructors. Somehow you're bringing Jim Sebenius, Mike Wheeler in class this way, right? Larry Zaskainen, you name them, right? So, and also we added 2 video conferences during PON Global where the audience could interact with the faculties they have seen on some of these videos. Then we have what I call the lecture videos. About 10 or 20 minutes summarizing key theories and frameworks, and we let those who have developed these frameworks, we let them present what they are. Advantage of this, and I've seen that because I've seen the same faculty offering the exact same lectures on site here at PON and through the videos, half of the time. Right? What sometimes you would hear in 40 minutes here, you would have 20 minutes there because it has to be prepared much better. It's much more, more professional in that sense, right? If you go on television, you better have a better sense of how you say things more effectively. 10, 20 minutes instead of 40. As a local instructors, we will often flip chart the main points, right? So they hear the videos the same way we would use flip charts in some of our courses. Participants don't get the videos, but get the key slides in a binder. Local instructors engage a conversation about after the videos because whatever lecture you provide, questions remain, and you need to be really accustomed to the theories and models to be able to interact and also make sure you answer the question from the audience, but also adjust what you're saying to the local context. If you have a video about multicultural negotiation, it will not be taught the same way if we do in Saudi Arabia or in London or in any other place. The next type of video we have is really what we asked is our faculty to share with us good stories. Could be Bill Urey talking about his meeting with President Chavez, I've chosen for us one very nice video with Mike Wheeler. It's a great way of using these small videos to get people back on time after a break, for example. We use it as an incentive to bring people back. And I use it in my courses. Also, video excerpts are great for that because students or participants don't want to miss it. So let me move to a little illustration of that video by Mike. So I will pass the beginning. So I'll go to 58. Sorry, Mike. We always feel really bad about this, but you know, sometimes we have no choice. So 58. So the story goes that it's about a contract with an athlete or a manager.
And said, and I'll call the player Bob, Bob, we'd love to have you on our team. You'd be a great steadying presence. We've got a lot of younger players. We're prepared to offer you $3 million for this coming year. Bob was down in Florida. He said, listen, thanks for the call. I'm interested, but I've got friends out in the car. I've already kept them waiting. We're going fishing. Let's talk tomorrow. So tomorrow comes, the general manager calls back and says, Bob, you know, I hope you've thought about my offer, but listen, I'm actually prepared to pay you $4 million for this coming year. They worked things out. It turned out to be a little bit more than 4 with various other benefits in the contract. But the player would have been willing to sign for something in the neighborhood of 3. And after this all happened, he told a friend, a mutual friend of mine and his, you know, that was the best day fishing I've ever had. It was worth more than $1 million to him. The general manager had made the classic mistake of bargaining against himself.
So that's an example, right? And again, normally 3 minutes, but I give you the core of this video. And yes, it's a great way of having Mike there, but you can't always have Mike everywhere, right? So the substance of their experience. And then the next example of the use of these videos is, it's a combination of what we have seen, lectures and insight, but using cartoons. Or at least I should say a very skilled cartoonist who will illustrate with colorful markers the main points of a video. And again, it keeps the audience really there. You saw the lecture video with Jared. That's probably more what you have in many PowerPoint animated videos. But with a cartoonist, it's like you were doing flip charting. But I don't know about you, but I'm not so great at flip charting. I know some people who are. And you will see the quality of this flip charting. And I will tell you another usual suspect you have seen around in this field, Larry. And Larry telling us about the Egyptian dam. So let me show you the end of this video. I'll go through it as I've done for the others, quite fast. Explanation about the story in a few lines. And then Larry introducing the conflict between 2 countries and the cartoonist really developing the conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt and telling the risks of war between them, conflict between upstream and downstream, and of course the risks around all of that. And I'll get to the little sequence. I think I thought I should put it up. Well, I can continue. So I can go on. The pride associated with this, and then we could go on, and I go to the end of the videos. So let me go to 4:15. Oh, that's too far.
They need to think about how perhaps the electricity generated from this big new dam might actually be sold to Egypt. Egypt's worried if it doesn't have enough water, it can't create enough electricity from the Aswan Dam. It needs the electricity. Well, what if there were a deal to ensure that Egypt had all the electricity it needed, because far more electricity will be produced by the Ethiopian dam than Ethiopia needs. They need to be in some kind of problem solving to generate new options for mutual advantage. They need to back off the big political debate caused by this back table problem and get into some kind of real problem solving.
So I think that's a very powerful way of teaching too, using great cartoonists, because it's very lively.
Welcome. My objective in the next hour or so is to look at what it means to teach negotiation online. And I'm going to use some examples from an online negotiation course that I've just developed at MIT. The particulars are much less important than the underlying pedagogical strategy of teaching negotiation online in what I'm calling an interactive way, and how you make negotiation instruction interactive. And I teach my courses online to a global audience simultaneously. So you can think edX, but you don't have to put it on edX. But the idea is I'm teaching many hundreds of people simultaneously, and they're all in very different places. And so how can you make this work? So I have a 3-week course. And this is a course for scientists and engineers who want to learn about negotiation as a leadership skill, as something they need to lead scientific and technical teams inside a company, across companies, but this is mostly about negotiation as a leadership skill. And so the question is, how do you design a 3-week negotiation course for any group, but my task was for this group in particular. And they're all in different places, taking this course because they want to, not because someone's told them they have to. And I divided the 3 weeks into negotiation, influence, and power. There's nothing special about that. You could divide up the 3 weeks in a different way, but I want the weeks to have beginning, middle, and end for a week, and then beginning, middle, and end for a week. I don't want this to run long, and I want people to have a sense that I finished a piece before I start the next piece. It's not like an academic course where at the end of 12 or 14 weeks you take an exam, and that's when you find out whether you learned the stuff. I'm really trying to make it in smaller pieces. In fact, the whole rule of thumb for me in translating what I've always taught in a classroom or in a training center to online is everything's in little pieces. And you'll see that when I try to construct and build the elements, when I use video elements, I try to work in 6-minute pieces. Maybe I have 2 pieces, so 12 minutes on a subject, but ideally 6 minutes. So what I would normally cover in a 50-minute class session, 6 minutes. And when I try to explain to my colleagues who've never done things online, this is not about putting a camera in front of you while you're teaching in your classroom, making a tape of it, and then running it online. It's not about that. It's about taking what you would do in the classroom, knowing it, then thinking about from the standpoint of a student, how could they learn that in 6 minutes? Everything is from the standpoint of the learner when you're putting things online. Not, as it's usually done, the standpoint of the teacher, I'll tell you what I'm going to say, and however long it takes me, that's how long it takes me. And at the end of it, I'll see whether you heard what I was going to say. This is not how we design online instruction. We say, what do we need to ensure that the learner will learn? And when we ask questions to people, like a little quiz after readings, we give the answer after they tried it a bunch of times. We give the correct answer and explain why the others were wrong, and this is the correct answer. We don't just have the questions. You have to assume from the standpoint of the learner, okay, I didn't know. What's the right answer? Why? And that has to be there. So I'm building in some cases, readings and questions. I'm building in video instruction, where I produce a video that explains something. And in that production process, I might make some notes to myself about something I want to teach, and I might have 6 minutes to teach it. I'm probably not going to have more than 8 points I'm going to try to make in that 6 minutes. And so if I'm in the process of producing this, I might have on the teleprompter the 8 points, and they're going at a pace where I got to get to the next one, and if I don't get to all of them, it's going to be more than 6 minutes. So that's the timer, is I'm trying to cover these points. I don't have a script about the things I'm going to say in the sentences about each of those 8 points, because I know roughly what I'm going to try to get across, and I know the material, and so I'm just trying to speak in a normal way, the way I would if I was talking to a student, trying to explain that point. And we take that video of me saying those things, and I try to figure what would be useful animation with my voice left, but my image gone, so that the image is now some graphic, some cartoon-like activity, some sort of animation of that idea. So if I were to be doing something on building coalitions, sources of negotiating power, they read something about it, and I'm getting ready to introduce them to the exercise they're going to do, which I'm going to show you some of, and I want to get them thinking about sources of negotiating power, and I have a point I want to make about it, which is power in negotiation is dynamic. It's not fixed. You can generate sources of power in negotiation regardless of your level of power vis-a-vis the other person away from the table. Could be the boss, and you could be a third level down employee. How do you get power in that negotiation? Well, if you can anticipate, understand all the boss's concerns, interests, needs, values, interests, and you can propose something that meets those while also meeting your interests, that's a source of power, the power of an elegant solution. So I might say on the video, we can talk about 3 sources of power in negotiation. One of them is the power of an elegant solution. So imagine the boss has put you inside a task, and the task has been framed in a way you think is all wrong. But you do not have the power to reframe that, only the boss does. You have 5 minutes to meet with the boss. How are you going to prepare? Do you know what the boss's objectives were in giving you this assignment, what the boss's most important interests are? How can you meet those interests while meeting yours? I just used my minute. But what can I show if my voice is saying that while they're listening to me, which is suddenly a figure appears who's the boss, and suddenly a figure appears that's you, the person listening. And they're stylized graphical figures. And there's endless debates about whether gender should be indicated, culture should be indicated. I don't want robots. What do I want that suggests variability in terms, so there's big debates about what to do about these illustrations, but putting that aside, it might show that the character that is the lower level person is asking a question. What are your interests, boss? And the boss responds by saying, having you finish the task on time. No, what I meant was, why did you give me, and you could see a dialogue happening like a cartoon strip. While I'm talking in the spaces, we use animation so it doesn't add to the time, which is why I have only so few points I can make within my small number of minutes.
We're late in the day. I have the dubious task of summing up what, for me, has been a very, very exciting day. So I want to start by thanking Larry and Lara for inviting me to take part, and everybody else who has been working hard to make this happen. And I want to thank you. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then I have some more or less first impressions of what I saw and heard. A dozen years ago, I gave a talk at an international conference that turned into an article for the Negotiation Journal. The title of which was, "Is Teaching Negotiation Too Hard, Too Easy, or Both?" The too easy part is everybody understands it's relevant. People like to do the exercises. All of that wins us praise. Is it too hard? Yes, it is too hard. Because we're talking about skills that are both analytic and interpersonal, involves emotional intelligence, self-awareness, all those kinds of things. We have students, whether we're teaching in a business school, a law school, whether we're doing corporate training, we have students who are bringing very different experiences, temperaments, personalities, and values to the table. My goodness, right? And we're purporting to help them not just know about negotiation, but to do it more effectively. Too hard, too easy, or both? It's both. And I feel deeply today much more optimistic and positive about what we're doing in the world, in part from what I've heard from colleagues, but I know Bruno and I know Larry and the others that you have worked with today. But I must say, the level of interest and commitment that I heard in all the conversations here really has been, for an old guy, very, very heartening. Then I was with Alain, I'm not going in chronological order, over here where he was talking about video in teaching. We've had this great negotiator project for almost 20 years now, led by our colleague Jim Sebanius, that's also the Secretary of State project. I urge you to take a look at that portfolio of material. He was showing some Tommy Coe video from Singapore. I've used that. I've used the Christo Jean-Claude. These are these extravagant artists who go where they're not invited and build things that confuse people. It may take years, even decades, for them to get approvals and support, and remarkable stories and all of that. So I urge you to mind that. Larry, when you were talking about online education here, you showed some video. I love you, Larry, right? And one of the things I love is that we can disagree on things. You are more enthusiastic than I am about videoing simulated negotiations. Now, I'm going to back off that a little bit. But at the very least, I want people who do it all the time. So in the discount marketplace video, which is classic, we got real negotiators who do these deals all the day, all times, as opposed to here are your interests, here are your interests. I like that even better as we get real-time stuff. And we rarely have it. When I was teaching in the master class on Wednesday, I showed a classic, grainy, profane documentary called Final Offer. How many people know it? So this was on emotion. And I did it in stop action, selected clips, and so forth. It's real people being very angry with one another, sometimes honestly, sometimes tactically, and so forth. And watching different levels of emotional intelligence there is great. Then I remember, before you actually did the online stuff, you were doing the climate dialogues and so forth, and you got a question. People aren't in the same seats now, but somebody asked you, when you're trying to create a dialogue in these communities, what happens when you encounter non-believers, that climate change is a hoax and so forth. I found very interesting your method of tracking over time whether priorities change and how they change, and how the care with which you take to interview people, where you're not attributing to them particular things, what you're doing is getting points of view in broad categories and so forth. I thought that was very interesting because, as Bruno was saying, in this fractious world that we live in, as citizens, even if we're not actively mediating, we need to think about how we engage people in dialogue. Then, first thing in the morning, with Monica and Brian, talking also about, dealing with issues that confront their students at the Kennedy School of Government. Brian came up with the term stuckedness. Is that the correct term? You get a nickel. Stickiness, thank you. That's why I asked for a correction. But there are instances, as Brian said, people talk, people come to the table, but yes is not going to be a word that is uttered there. And you mentioned the concept of judgmental overconfidence. I think I'm close on that. Mary Rowe used to call it fourth quadrant conflict. Instead of moving north and east with mutual gains, we're sinking south and west, where my only consolation is, as much as I'm hurting you even more, and those downward spiraling kinds of disputes. It's important that we face up to that and face up to the fact that some of the standard doctrine, as optimistic as it is, really hits a brick wall. And we've got to think very creatively about what we do in those situations and how, in fact, we can teach it better. Then I was in Gabby's class, teaches at a law school and so forth. Like me, she likes simple problems. She played the ultimatum game, if you know the divide of fixed pie, yes or no. If you say yes, you get what you get. If you say no, nobody gets anything. Larry's built this wonderful entrepreneurial negotiation course at MIT with the support of MIT. I've, with lots of help, built the HBS course. What interests me is what you people can do if you aren't so lucky to be in institutions that, frankly, are awash in money. With the help of somebody in our library, I built an ultimatum game using Qualtrics. There didn't have to be any kind of, it's a polling function, just hacking that. There's stuff that you can do. When we think about the videos that you made and that I made in the courses, there's something called the iPhone. And I think you can make very credible films on that. And I would suggest, nobody is nearly as old as I am here, but you know lots of people who are interesting negotiators. Interview them. And I would suggest in open-ended, tell me stories. And from those, you ought to be able, without being a film editor, be able to get nuggets that you can use in class. Ideally, find somebody who says, make the first offer, somebody else who doesn't, and they tell you a credible story on both sides and say, okay, students, which is it? When do you want to make the first offer? When do you not? So I think a lot of this technology is going to be accessible, and I go back to iDecision and so forth. If you wanted to build an online course or a hybrid course, you'd have that to support distribution and so forth, and these kinds of products could fit into it. There's another thing that Gabby said in passing, that she came here as somebody who had done very serious negotiations between her home country of Israel and Syria and so forth. And when she started to take a negotiation course, more than yawning, she kind of raised her eyebrows and so forth, thinking, this is some kind of oversimplifying the world. And she used, I hope I'm attributing correctly, she used the word condescending, sort of the notion that if you don't buy into the 7 elements, somehow something is remiss. I think we've got to be very careful ourselves. I once did a study. I had the good luck with Jim Sebanius and David Lax to do a training for the general managers of the National Hockey League and their assistant general managers. And we did an exercise where I came up with a real player, what his statistics were, he's coming into free agency and so forth. Half of you are the team general managers. The other half are the people that you hate, the agents. Tell me what you're shooting for in terms of a 3-year deal. Tell me what is the most you will pay if you are the team. What's the least you accept as the player. If you took those 2 numbers, the reservation price for the team, the reservation price for the players, and tried to make the most deals, there were 50 people, let's say, there were 25 pairs, there were only 3 deals. There were only 3 possible deals. There was a gap. And one of my young and very earnest colleagues said that data has to be wrong. There has to be a ZOPA. Well, not in the world that I live in, right? And not in the world in which these people live in. So I think that we need to be a little more humble about a one-size-fits-all kind of prescription. So then we jump to Melissa and Lakshmi in business down here. Lakshmi used to work with me. We've written some things together and so forth. And Melissa was into online education before just about anybody. They did a simple policy, a goodly number of you, policy exercise where you had to sign up other people who had done something. For example, have you ever knitted? No, right? You know, have you ever taught an advanced negotiation course? Maybe. So you could sign my document for that. And in 3 minutes, you know, people are running around to get as many people to sign the document. There was, what, somebody who got 13, there might have been a 10, and most were in single digits. And then, I think it was Lakshmi who said it, there was somebody in another class who got 25. And they got 25 because, in my view, they thought about process. They stood up and they stood in the corner and says, listen, I've done number 7. Anybody want me to sign number 7 for them? Come to me and then sign up. So thinking about, I mean, I was just there for what, the 20 minutes. I'm not going to forget that, Melissa. You know, so sometimes the simple things we can do be very powerful. So when I say walk the talk, there sometimes you can walk and stumble. I've done that more than once. I'm looking at the edge of the stage here as I say it. But I hope you can follow Bruno's inspiration and teach in a loving way, because what we teach and what we do is so fundamental to who we are in society. So thank you so much for coming. Carry on the great work, and please, please, please keep in touch.